Case 1. Brenda Delgado. She ended up on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. She was the 506th person ever placed on that list, and only the 9th woman in its entire history. A $100,000 reward was posted for her capture. She had fled the country, and the reason she ran traces back to a parking garage in uptown Dallas, a dentist named Kendra Hatcher, and a former relationship she refused to let go. On September 2, 2015, Dallas Police Department patrol units responded to a shooting at a residential apartment complex on McKinney Avenue in the uptown neighborhood of Dallas, Texas. The victim was Dr. Kendra Hatcher, 35 years old, a pediatric dentist who had recently joined a Dallas practice called Smile Zone, a clinic providing dental care to children from underserved communities. She had moved to Texas specifically for that position. Dr. Hatcher was pronounced dead at the scene. The immediate staging of the scene suggested a robbery. But within 48 hours, investigators identified 2 individuals on surveillance footage in the vicinity of the parking garage before and during the shooting. Those individuals were identified as Christopher Love and Crystal Cortez. And when detectives began pulling the thread on who had connected those 2 people to Kendra Hatcher, the investigation led directly to a woman named Brenda Delgado. Delgado was 32 years old. She had been in a relationship for over 2 years with a man named Dr. Ricardo Paniagua, a medical professional in the Dallas area. That relationship ended in February of 2015. According to email records later introduced at trial, Paniagua informed Delgado by June of 2015 that he had moved on and was in a new relationship with Kendra Hatcher. Investigators determined that Delgado had been monitoring Paniagua's communications. Cell phone records placed her in the same geographic locations as Love and Cortez in the days before the shooting. Surveillance items were later recovered from her possession, including binoculars that co-conspirator Crystal Cortez testified she and Delgado had used to observe Dr. Hatcher from outside her dental office. Multiple witnesses, including members of Delgado's own family and personal circle, testified at trial that she had approached them separately about harming Hatcher before she recruited Love and Cortez. The plan, as established through court testimony, was organized and paid for by Delgado. Love was the triggerman. Cortez drove the vehicle. The agreed compensation was a combination of drugs and currency. Before Dallas detectives could arrest her, Brenda Delgado fled to Mexico. The FBI placed her on the 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list on April 6, 2016. On April 8, 2016, 2 days later, agents of the Mexican Attorney General's Office and Criminal Investigations Agency, coordinating with the FBI's attaché in Mexico City, arrested her in the city of Torreon, in the state of Coahuila. The extradition process took months. Mexico prohibits extraditing individuals to face the death penalty. Dallas County prosecutors entered into a formal agreement under which capital punishment would not be pursued in exchange for her return to the United States. She was extradited on October 6, 2016. The trials of all 3 defendants proceeded separately over the following years. Christopher Love was tried first. On October 31, 2018, a Dallas County jury convicted him of capital murder. He was sentenced to death and currently remains on death row at the Allen B. Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas. Crystal Cortez entered a guilty plea to the lesser charge of murder in exchange for her agreement to cooperate fully as the prosecution's primary witness against both Love and Delgado. She was sentenced to 35 years. Brenda Delgado's capital murder trial began in June of 2019. Prosecutors presented cell phone location data, surveillance video, financial records, the testimony of Crystal Cortez, and the independent testimony of Delgado's own family members and friends, each of whom told the jury that Delgado had approached them about the situation before Love and Cortez were recruited. The defense argued that Cortez had fabricated Delgado's involvement to secure a reduced sentence and that she and Love had acted independently. The jury deliberated for less than 20 minutes. On June 7, 2019, they returned a unanimous verdict of guilty on the charge of capital murder. Because of the extradition agreement, the death penalty was not available. Brenda Delgado received an automatic sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. She showed no emotion when the verdict was read. In 2021, the Fifth Court of Appeals of Texas reviewed all 11 issues raised on appeal and affirmed the conviction in full, finding no reversible error. Brenda Delgado is currently serving her sentence within the Texas Department of Criminal Justice system. She will not leave that system. Kendra Hatcher was 35 years old. Case 2. Diane Zamora. The case broke open not in Texas, but in Annapolis, Maryland, on the campus of the United States Naval Academy, when a freshman midshipman told her roommates that her fiancé had killed a girl in Texas to prove his love for her. Those roommates reported it to Academy officials. Academy officials called law enforcement in Grand Prairie, and a 9-month-old cold case was suddenly back open. That is where this case begins, not with the crime itself, but with the confession that solved it. On the morning of December 4, 1995, a resident of Grand Prairie, Texas, found a body on his rural property near Seaton Road, adjacent to Joe Pool Lake. The victim was a 16-year-old female who had sustained 2 gunshot wounds and a severe head injury. She was positively identified as Adrienne Jones, a sophomore at Mansfield High School who had been reported missing the previous evening. Adrienne Jones was a cross-country runner and honor student. Her family had described her as someone with clear plans for her future, university, behavioral psychology, a path she had mapped out. Grand Prairie Police Department investigators opened a homicide investigation. They conducted over 300 interviews. They processed the physical evidence. They built a timeline of her last known movements. After 9 months, the case had gone cold. No viable suspect had emerged. Then came the call from Annapolis. Diane Zamora was 17 years old in December of 1995. She attended Crowley High School in Crowley, Texas, ranked in the top 10% of her class, and had been accepted to the United States Naval Academy. Her boyfriend, David Graham, attended Mansfield High School, the same school Adrienne Jones attended, and had been accepted to the United States Air Force Academy. The two had met in 1991 through the Civil Air Patrol. They began dating in August of 1995 and announced their engagement to their families within weeks. According to statements Graham eventually provided to investigators, in November of 1995, he disclosed to Zamora that he had been sexually involved with his cross-country teammate, Adrienne Jones. That disclosure, according to the account he gave police, sent Zamora into a state of extreme anger. She demanded, according to his statement, that he kill Jones. It is worth noting that at Graham's subsequent trial, multiple witnesses, including a teammate and a coach, testified that the sexual encounter Graham described may not have occurred as he claimed. Graham himself later recanted portions of his account. The investigation determined that on the specific evening he referenced, the physical circumstances did not support his version of events. Regardless of whether the underlying encounter occurred, what is established in the court record is what happened next. On the night of December 3, 1995, Graham contacted Adrienne Jones and arranged to pick her up from her home. Zamora was concealed in the rear of the vehicle. They drove to the area near Joe Pool Lake. The attack on Jones took place at that location. Both Zamora and Graham gave statements to investigators after their arrests. The murder weapons, a 9mm handgun and a dumbbell weight, were recovered from Graham's attic during the investigation. Both Zamora and David Graham were arrested on September 6, 1996. Diane Zamora's trial commenced in February of 1998 in Tarrant County. The prosecution called 4 separate witnesses, former friends and acquaintances from Texas and from the Naval Academy, each of whom testified that Zamora had voluntarily described the events of that night to them in detail. According to their collective testimony, she had described Graham killing Jones as an act carried out at her direction. Zamora took the stand in her own defense. She testified that Graham had acted alone and that she had not participated in the attack. She also attempted to characterize Graham as controlling and manipulative. The jury found her account unpersuasive in light of the consistency of the other witnesses. After more than 6 hours of deliberations across 2 days, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of capital murder on February 17, 1998. Because the Jones family had made a direct request that prosecutors not seek the death penalty, Zamora was automatically sentenced to life imprisonment with parole eligibility after 40 years. She will not be eligible for parole until 2036, at which point she will be in her late 50s. David Graham was tried separately 5 months later. His defense argued he was not at the scene, while offering no alibi. The jury rejected that argument and convicted him of capital murder on July 24, 1998. He received an identical sentence. Both Diane Zamora and David Graham remain incarcerated within the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System. The case was broken entirely because Diane Zamora chose to tell her Naval Academy roommates what had happened. Without that disclosure, investigators may never have identified a suspect. The case remains a documented study in how voluntary admissions made to third parties can generate prosecutable leads in otherwise cold homicide investigations. Adrienne Jones was 16 years old. Case 3. Enideria Flowers. She called for her co-defendant to open fire in front of the victim's own family. Isaiah Roper was killed in his family's home in the early hours of the morning while his relatives watched. Enideria Flowers, his girlfriend, was the one who directed it. On September 5, 2018, in the early morning hours, Enideria Flowers and a man named James Johnson went to the home of the Roper family in San Antonio, Texas. The visit occurred after Isaiah Roper, 24 years old, had recently moved out of Flowers' apartment, ending his residential arrangement with her. According to the Bexar County District Attorney's Office, Flowers got into a physical confrontation with Roper and members of his family upon arriving. During that confrontation, Flowers produced a knife. The weapon was taken away from her during the altercation. At that point, according to the prosecution's account, Flowers turned to James Johnson, who had accompanied her, and directed him to shoot Isaiah Roper. Johnson shot Roper in the presence of his family members. Isaiah Roper died from his injuries. The investigation was conducted by the San Antonio Police Department. Both Flowers and Johnson were identified, and the case was developed through witness accounts from individuals who had been present, members of the Roper family who had witnessed the events from the moment Flowers and Johnson arrived at the residence. The physical and testimonial evidence established the chain of events clearly. Flowers had arrived at the location with Johnson. She had initiated the confrontation. She had produced a weapon. When that weapon was removed from her possession, she directed Johnson to use his. The presence of family members as direct witnesses to the sequence meant the investigative record was built on first-hand testimony. Enideria Flowers was charged with murder in connection with the death of Isaiah Roper. She entered a guilty plea to the murder charge in 2020. The case then moved to the sentencing phase, which did not occur until April of 2022, more than 2 years after the plea. A delay the Bexar County District Attorney's Office directly addressed in their public statement following sentencing. On April 25, 2022, Enideria Flowers was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Bexar County District Attorney Joe Gonzalez issued a statement following sentencing. After a delay by this defendant of more than 2 years, I am glad the Roper family finally has some closure and justice in this case. The case illustrates a documented pattern in intimate partner homicide cases, the use of a third party to carry out violence against a former partner following the dissolution of a residential relationship. Flowers did not personally fire the weapon that killed Isaiah Roper. The prosecution established that she directed the person who did, making her criminally responsible for the outcome under Texas law. The sentencing of 18 years meant Flowers would be eligible for parole consideration after serving a portion of that term under Texas Department of Criminal Justice guidelines. The Roper family, who were present at the scene when the offense occurred, were also present at the sentencing. The victim impact process gave them a formal opportunity to address the court, which they did. Isaiah Roper was 24 years old. He had moved out of the defendant's apartment before his death. The investigation, prosecution, and sentencing in this case moved through the Bexar County court system over a period of approximately 4 years from offense to final sentence, a timeline shaped in part by the extended gap between Flowers' guilty plea in 2020 and the eventual sentencing hearing in 2022. The Dallas Police Department Homicide Unit, the San Antonio Police Department, and the Bexar County District Attorney's Office each played documented roles in cases within this episode. This case represents the San Antonio jurisdiction and confirms that the pattern of intimate partner violence resulting in criminal prosecution is not limited to the large metropolitan centers of Dallas and Houston, but extends across the full geographic span of the state of Texas. Enideria Flowers is currently serving her sentence within the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System. Isaiah Roper was 24 years old. Case 4. Holly and Elkins. She spent months building a case against a woman who had done nothing wrong. She filed false police reports. She scratched her own chest and told officers a rival had attacked her. She helped plant drugs and a firearm in that woman's vehicle and then called 911 under a fake name to report her. She paid a private investigator to dig up damaging information. And when none of it worked, when Alyssa Burkett was still alive, still present, still connected to the man Holly Elkins intended to keep, she sent a text that prosecutors would later read to a jury. "I hope you handle it." 1 week later, Alyssa Burkett was dead. Holly and Elkins was the fiancée of a man named Andrew Beard, who resided in Rockwall, Texas. Andrew Beard had a prior relationship with 24-year-old Alyssa Burkett. By 2020, that prior relationship had ended and Burkett had moved on. She was working at an apartment complex in Carrollton, Texas, in the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area. According to the evidence presented at trial and the detailed account established in court records, Elkins became consumed by the continued existence of Burkett in the orbit of her relationship with Beard. What followed was not a single act, but a documented campaign lasting months, conducted by both Elkins and Beard together, that used deception, false reporting, surveillance, and the manipulation of law enforcement as instruments against the victim. In June of 2020, Elkins and Beard conspired to place a GPS tracking device on Burkett's vehicle without her knowledge or consent. The device allowed them to monitor her location in real time. In July of 2020, Elkins placed a call to 911 under the false name Amber, reporting that Burkett's vehicle was driving erratically on an interstate. No such conduct had occurred. The report was fabricated. In August of 2020, Elkins filed a false police report claiming that Burkett's mother had physically attacked her. To support the false claim, she created visible scratches on her own chest before making the report. 5 days after that false report, Elkins and Beard hired a licensed private investigator and directed him to compile damaging information on Burkett and her new boyfriend. The investigator conducted his work, testified at trial, and confirmed he found nothing incriminating. In September of 2020, Elkins and Beard planted a quantity of drugs and a firearm inside Burkett's vehicle. Beard then called police under a false name, claiming Burkett was selling drugs from her car. Officers investigated. No charges were filed against Burkett. On September 10, 2020, 3 weeks before Burkett's death, Elkins sent Beard a text message. The prosecution read that message to the jury during trial. It read, "I hope you handle it." She also referred to him as her ride or die. On October 2, 2020, Alyssa Burkett was at work at the Carrollton apartment complex where she was employed. Andrew Beard went to that location. Burkett was killed. She had sustained both gunshot and stab wounds. During the time of the murder, Holly Elkins was at Beard's home in Rockwall with Burkett's daughter, who had been left in her care. Following the killing, Elkins attempted to provide Beard with an alibi by claiming to investigators that he had been home with her during the time Burkett was killed. That claim was contradicted by the evidence. The investigation was conducted jointly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Dallas Field Office, the Carrollton Police Department, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives Dallas Field Office. The multi-agency structure reflected the federal nature of the charges. The stalking statutes under which Elkins was ultimately prosecuted fall within federal jurisdiction when they involve interstate conduct and result in death. Investigators reconstructed the full timeline of the campaign against Burkett using phone records, the GPS tracker data, the 911 call recordings, the false police report filings, and the private investigator's testimony. The text messages between Elkins and Beard provided direct documentary evidence of the coordinated nature of the scheme. Holly and Elkins was indicted in federal court in the Northern District of Texas in June of 2023. Andrew Beard entered a guilty plea separately to federal charges of stalking using a dangerous weapon resulting in death and discharging a firearm during a crime of violence. He was sentenced to 43 years in federal prison. Holly Elkins proceeded to trial. In April of 2024, a federal jury convicted her on all counts: conspiracy to stalk, stalking using a dangerous weapon resulting in death, and brandishing a firearm in relation to a crime of violence. The case was presided over by United States District Judge Jane Boyle, the same judge who had sentenced Jennifer Faith in a separate Dallas area case 2 years earlier. On August 15, 2024, Judge Boyle sentenced Holly and Elkins to 2 consecutive life terms in federal prison. 2 consecutive life sentences, not concurrent, meaning the sentences do not run alongside each other, but one after the other, effectively eliminating any realistic prospect of release. The prosecution's framing of Elkins's role was direct. Assistant United States Attorneys Gary Tremblay, Rick Calvert, and Ryan Niedermeyer argued throughout the case that Elkins was not a peripheral participant. They characterized her as the organizer, the person who drove the campaign against Burkett, coordinated its steps, and communicated its ultimate objective to Beard in writing before the murder occurred. Burkett's new boyfriend testified at trial that in his view, Elkins was the central force behind everything that had been done to Alyssa Burkett. He used the term puppet master. The jury agreed. Holly and Elkins is currently serving 2 consecutive life sentences in federal custody. Alyssa Burkett was 24 years old. Case 5. Ana Trujillo. When Houston police arrived at the condominium on the evening of June 9, 2013, Ana Trujillo answered the door. She had blood on her clothing and on her hands. Her boyfriend, 59-year-old Dr. Alf Stephan Anderson, a University of Houston professor and researcher, was lying in the hallway. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The instrument used to cause his injuries was recovered at the scene. It was her shoe. Ana Trujillo was 45 years old at the time of the offense. She and Anderson had been in a romantic relationship and were living together at his condominium in a residential building in Houston, Texas. Anderson was a Swedish-born academic who had become a United States citizen. Colleagues and witnesses who testified at trial described him consistently as mild-mannered and non-confrontational. The evening of June 9, 2013 began with the couple returning home together by taxicab from a social outing. The cab driver who transported them that evening was called as a prosecution witness at trial. He testified that during the ride, Trujillo had been visibly agitated and was arguing with Anderson. The couple arrived at Anderson's condominium building and entered his unit. Houston Police Department officers were called to the location shortly thereafter. Upon arrival, they found Anderson had died from his injuries. Trujillo was present and taken into custody for questioning. The physical evidence documented at the scene became central to the prosecution's case. Investigators recovered a blue suede platform stiletto shoe with a 5.5-inch heel. Forensic examination of the scene and of the victim established that Anderson had sustained multiple wounds consistent with repeated contact with a narrow-pointed implement. The medical examiner's findings were presented in detail at trial. A critical element of the physical evidence was the absence of defensive injuries on Trujillo and their presence on Anderson. Prosecution forensic witnesses testified that Anderson had defensive wounds on his hands and wrists, injuries consistent with attempting to protect oneself, while Trujillo had no injuries consistent with being physically attacked. The prosecution's theory, argued to the jury by prosecutor John Jordan, was that following the couple's return home, a confrontation escalated. Evidence supported that Anderson fell to the floor and that Trujillo, positioned above him, used her shoe to deliver repeated strikes. The prosecution argued the defensive wounds on Anderson's hands were consistent with him attempting to shield himself during the attack. Trujillo's police interrogation was recorded and played for the jury at trial. In that recording, she told detectives that Anderson had become enraged, believing she was going to leave him, and had attacked her. She stated she had used her shoe as the only available means of defending herself. She told detectives she had struck him a couple of times and had not understood the extent of his injuries until she saw blood. She stated she had attempted to perform CPR. Trujillo's defense at trial was self-defense. Her attorneys argued that she had a documented history of being a victim of domestic violence at the hands of multiple prior partners, and that Anderson had become physically aggressive with her on the night in question, that he had chased her, knocked her into a wall, and thrown her over a couch. Defense counsel argued the prosecution had not established motive and that Trujillo's actions constituted reasonable self-defense under Texas law. Prosecutors systematically addressed each element of the defense's account. They pointed to the physical evidence, specifically the pattern of Anderson's injuries, the number of wounds documented by the medical examiner at 25 or more, and the forensic evidence showing Anderson in a defensive position. They argued that the evidence was inconsistent with a single act of self-defense and more consistent with a sustained and one-sided attack. They also called witnesses who testified that Anderson had no history of violence and was uniformly described by those who knew him as a calm and gentle individual. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty of murder on April 8, 2014. Trujillo showed minimal reaction when the verdict was announced. The case then moved to the punishment phase. Prosecutors asked the jury to impose the maximum sentence, life in prison. Defense counsel requested the jury consider a minimum sentence of 2 years, arguing that Trujillo had acted in a moment of emotional crisis rather than through premeditation. Before sentencing, Trujillo addressed the court directly. She stated that she had never intended to hurt Anderson and that she had loved him. On April 11, 2014, the jury assessed punishment at life imprisonment. The trial court formally imposed that sentence the same day. Trujillo filed a notice of appeal on May 7, 2014. The appeal raised, among other issues, a claim that she had been without appointed appellate counsel during part of the 30-day window available under Texas law to file a motion for a new trial, a procedural issue arising from the gap between her trial counsel's withdrawal and the appointment of new counsel. The Texas Court of Appeals reviewed the issue and determined that while the gap in representation had occurred, it was harmless beyond a reasonable doubt because no facially plausible grounds for a new trial had been identified. The conviction and life sentence were affirmed on appeal. Ana Trujillo is currently serving her life sentence within the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System. The Trujillo case drew sustained attention nationally in part because of the unusual nature of the physical evidence, the use of a shoe as a weapon, and in part because of the self-defense question the case raised. Texas law permits the use of force in self-defense when a person reasonably believes it is immediately necessary to protect themselves from another's use of unlawful force. The jury, having heard both sides' accounts and reviewed the forensic evidence, determined that the elements of lawful self-defense had not been established. The case was prosecuted in Harris County and tried before a jury that reached its verdict after receiving the full presentation of physical evidence, forensic testimony, witness accounts, and the recorded police interview of the defendant herself. Dr. Alf Stephan Anderson was 59 years old. 5 cases, 5 Texas courtrooms, 5 convictions, all reached through investigation, prosecution, and jury deliberation. Different cities, different decades, different methods. But in every case, the evidence told the story. That is what cold justice does. We follow the record all the way to the verdict. If this episode was useful to you, like this video. It helps more people find this channel. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. New episodes every week. And drop a comment below. Tell us which state or case type you want next. We read every single one. Cold Justice will be back.